All right, let's do this. We're going deep into Gilded Age finance today with Henry Clews and his memoir, 50 Years in Wall Street. You know, you gave me some excerpts from his 1908 book, and I'm already hooked.
Yeah, it's one of those books that feels surprisingly relevant. I mean, even over a century later,
Right.
Clews wasn't just, some Wall Street observer. He was right there in the thick of it, like financing wars, navigating those crazy panics. And, he was rubbing shoulders with guys like Vanderbilt and Gould.
I can picture it now, those smoky back rooms,
Mhm.
fortunes being made and lost with every whisper.
Oh, absolutely.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, can you give our listeners a little background on Clews himself?
Mm.
Who was this guy?
Well, he was a British immigrant, actually. Came to America in the mid-19th century.
Oh.
It was supposed to be just a short visit.
Yeah.
But he was totally captivated by, well, the energy and opportunity here, especially in the booming financial world of New York City.
So he saw Wall Street exploding and thought, I gotta be a part of this.
Exactly. He quickly established himself as a major player, like a key role in financing the Union during the Civil War,
Wow.
which is a whole other story. But his memoir goes way beyond that. It gives us this, insider's perspective on how Wall Street really worked during, one of the most transformative times in American history.
So what's the main point of the book? What was he trying to get across to his readers?
Well, at its core, 50 Years in Wall Street is really an exploration of speculation.
Okay.
Its power, its pitfalls, and its essential role in a functioning market, I mean. Clews argues that speculation, when done responsibly, is actually vital for economic growth and progress, even.
That's interesting because you always hear speculation as like a dirty word,
All right.
Something reckless and dangerous. But Clews is saying it's more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. He doesn't shy away from the risks, of course.
Right.
There's a whole chapter outlining the causes of losses in speculation. He warns about inadequate information, false rumors, the perils of relying on those insider tips. But he also makes this very compelling case that without speculation, markets would be stagnant and less efficient overall.
He sounds like a guy who understood the psychology of the markets,
Yeah.
as much as the mechanics of it all.
Exactly. And that's what makes the book so fascinating. He was a keen observer of human nature.
Yeah.
And he understood how emotions like fear and greed,
Yeah.
could drive markets to these totally irrational highs and lows.
Speaking of those irrational highs, you mentioned Clews, rubbed elbows with guys like Vanderbilt and Gould.
Oh, yeah.
These are like the most powerful figures of their time, known for some pretty audacious moves, including those infamous corners they engineered them to manipulate the market, right?
Right.
Can you explain to our listeners what a corner is and why it was such a potent tactic back then?
A corner is essentially an attempt to control the supply of something. Like a commodity or a stock, you create this, artificial scarcity to drive up the price. Imagine you buy up almost all the wheat in the country. You'd control the price, and anyone who needs wheat, they have to come to you at your price.
It sounds like a legal form of extortion.
It was certainly ethically questionable, but yeah, it was legal at the time. And Clews details how figures like Commodore Vanderbilt used corners to make their fortunes.
Okay.
He describes this infamous Harlem corner, where Vanderbilt basically squeezed the New York City Council into giving him what he wanted by manipulating the price of Harlem Railroad stock.
Wow. Talk about wielding power.
Yeah, it was incredible.
But these corners weren't just like abstract market manipulations, right? They had real-world consequences, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Clews points out that, while corners could generate enormous profits for those who engineered them,
Yeah.
they could also lead to devastating losses for those caught on the wrong side. He even argues that, attempts to legislate against corners could actually stifle speculation and ultimately harm the economy, which is fascinating.
It makes you think about the role of regulation. Where do you draw the line between protecting people and allowing for innovation and risk?
Exactly. And that's a debate that is still going on today.
So we've got speculation as a driving force, the dangers and potential of those corners. But I'm also curious about the human element here.
Yeah.
Clews gives these vivid portraits of the personalities who dominated Wall Street
Oh, yeah.
during this period. He's got stories about Vanderbilt, Drew, Gould, Keene, Warish Offer. It's all these larger-than-life figures, right?
Yeah.
With their own, quirks and rivalries and their own strategies for conquering the market. It's amazing.
It is, and that's one of the things that makes this book so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just this like dry analysis of financial trends.
Right.
It's full of these colorful anecdotes and insights into the minds of the men who shaped Wall Street.
Where should we start with this, like, rogues gallery of Gilded Age financiers? Who should we introduce our listener to first?
Well, he was one of the most powerful figures of the era.
Okay.
So perhaps we should begin with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore himself.
Okay, let's talk about Vanderbilt. This is a guy who started out in the steamboat business, battling those rivals for control of the Hudson River. Then he set his sights on railroads and made a fortune, like one of the richest men in America. It's incredible.
Clews describes him as a man of, like, immense energy, ambition, and ruthlessness. He was known for his fierce temper, his love of competition, and his willingness to use any means necessary to get what he wanted.
Wow.
I mean, he was a master of the corner, like we were discussing.
Yeah, the Harlem situation.
Exactly. But there's also the Hudson River corner,
Right.
where he drove up the price of the stock almost 70% in a matter of days,
Really?
crushing his opponents and solidifying his control of the railroad.
So he was like playing chess with the market, strategically outmaneuvering his opponents at every turn.
He absolutely was. But Clews also shows us that Vanderbilt wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He had this kind of quirky side.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
Clews tells the story about how Vanderbilt, in his later years, he would invite prominent artists to his home.
Right.
And he would critique their paintings,
Really?
particularly paintings depicting animals.
Wow.
Vanderbilt, with all his years in the cattle business, he considered himself an expert on animals.
Okay.
And he wouldn't hesitate to tell these renowned artists where they'd gone wrong in their depictions.
So you've got these highly esteemed artists being critiqued on, animal anatomy by a railroad tycoon. It's hilarious.
Right.
It's a fantastic story. It shows that, even at the height of his wealth and power, Vanderbilt was still that same blunt, opinionated guy who wasn't afraid to challenge anyone, even renowned artists, if he thought they were wrong. It reminds you that these titans of industry were still human.
Precisely. And Clews is really good at capturing those human moments, those little details that bring these figures to life.
So we got Vanderbilt, the force of nature, the master manipulator.
Yeah.
But Clews also tells us about Daniel Drew, a figure who I think in many ways embodies that boom and bust cycle of Wall Street.
Yeah, Drew is a fascinating character, real rags to riches to rags story.
Yeah.
He rose from, humble beginnings as a cattle drover
Okay.
and became one of the most powerful figures in finance, known for, cornering the market, outsmarting his rivals. But he was also prone to making impulsive decisions and trusting the wrong people.
Didn't he lose everything?
He did. Clews talks about how, in his later years, Drew would just sit in his hotel room, glued to the ticker tape, desperately trying to recapture that former glory. He died in obscurity, a real cautionary tale, I think, about the perils of overconfidence and the fleeting nature of fortune.
It reminds you that no one is invincible in the market, no matter how successful they might seem.
Exactly. Drew's story really highlights the importance of risk management, knowing when to walk away from a bad trade, and remembering that, even the most astute investors make mistakes.
A lesson that's as relevant today as it was back then, I think.
Yeah.
But we've got another fascinating figure here, waiting in the wings, Jay Gould.
Ah, Jay Gould. Now there's a complex character. Clews spends a good chunk of the memoir chronicling Gould's rise, detailing his, early struggles, his cunning maneuvers, and his ascent to becoming one of the most powerful and controversial figures in American finance.
He was involved in some of the most, notorious financial scandals of the time, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah.
The Erie Railroad Wars, the Black Friday Gold Corner. Those were huge events that, shook the nation.
He was right at the center of it all. And Clews doesn't shy away from detailing, Gould's questionable tactics.
Yeah.
But he also acknowledges his undeniable brilliance.
Interesting.
He describes Gould as a man of few words, a keen observer of human nature, and a master of exploiting, the weaknesses in his opponents. He was always one step ahead, always planning that next move, and always willing to push the boundaries, of what was considered acceptable in the pursuit of profit.
Sounds almost Machiavellian.
He certainly had that reputation, but Clews also gives us these glimpses of his, more human side.
Oh, okay.
He shares the story about how Gould, as a young man, he would walk miles to attend a lecture, or a debate, just, eager to absorb knowledge and hone his skills.
Wow.
It shows that, that relentless ambition that drove him to the top.
It's amazing. And of course, there's that hilarious story about, Gould being tricked into wading through a stream in his red underwear. It's a good reminder that even these seemingly invincible titans of industry had a vulnerable side.
It's a fantastic anecdote. It really humanizes him, makes him more relatable, even with all his flaws. Clews is great at finding those little details, the ones that make these historical figures come alive.
I'm sensing a pattern here. It's like Clews is drawing this contrast between the ruthless ambition and the cunning of someone like Gould, and the more impulsive and ultimately, self-destructive behavior of someone like Drew.
That's a great observation. And it speaks to one of the key themes of the book, the importance of temperament and character. When navigating Wall Street, it's a treacherous place.
Yeah, it's not just about being smart or having the right information.
No.
It's about having the discipline, the patience, the self-awareness to make, good decisions under pressure.
Exactly. And Clews highlights this through the stories of the various figures he encounters. He shows us how some, like Gould, were able to maintain their composure and adapt to changing circumstances, while others, like Drew, allowed their emotions to get the better of them, leading to their downfall.
So far, we've got Vanderbilt, Drew, and Gould, a pretty fascinating trio of Gilded Age financiers. Who else should we introduce our listener to?
Well, we can't forget James Keene, the man who made a fortune by short-selling the inflated bonanza stocks in San Francisco.
Ah, the legendary short seller. Betting against the crowd takes some guts, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And Keene had that in spades. He was fearless. He went against the prevailing sentiment and won big.
So he's the opposite of someone like Drew, who chased the hype and got burned. Keene saw through the hype, recognized the bubble, and then profited from it. It's amazing.
Exactly right. Clews describes how Keene, after making his initial fortune in California, came to New York to test his skills against the best.
Oh, wow.
And, he quickly proved that he was more than capable of holding his own. He understood the psychology of crowds, knew how to exploit that fear and greed that drive those speculative bubbles.
Sounds like he was a master of timing.
Yeah.
Knowing when to get in, when to get out.
Yeah.
And not being afraid to go against the grain.
He absolutely was. And his story is a great reminder that sometimes the biggest opportunities are found by going against the prevailing wisdom.
I'm sensing another contrast here. This time between Keene's calculated risk-taking and Gould's more manipulative approach.
That's a sharp observation.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the different strategies that can be successful.
Yeah.
Keene was this brilliant analyst. He understood those market cycles, and he was willing to bet against the crowd.
Okay.
Gould, on the other hand, was more of a tactician.
Yeah.
He was using his influence, his connections to kind of manipulate events to his advantage.
It's fascinating to see how Clews weaves these different personalities and approaches into his narrative.
Yeah.
He's not just giving us a history lesson.
No, he's not.
He's providing a framework for understanding how markets work, how human psychology plays a role, and the different paths, to success and failure.
Exactly, and that's why his book is still so relevant. The specific details of the Gilded Age might be different.
Yeah.
But those underlying principles of, speculation, risk, and human behavior, those are timeless.
We've got one more figure to introduce our listener to, right? Charles Wurschoffer.
Yes. Charles Wurschoffer.
Okay.
The master of the short sale.
He was known for his ability to read market trends.
Yeah?
And his willingness to bet against those overhyped companies.
Yeah.
Clews describes him as like a chronic and most destructive bear, which sounds almost ominous.
Yeah, he had a reputation for being a contrarian investor.
Okay.
Always on the lookout for cracks in that facade of prosperity. Clews tells us how Wurschoffer, after initially making his fortune, as a bull, he transformed into this bear, believing that those excesses of the market would lead to a correction.
So he was like Keene, in that he saw opportunity in those market downturns, but perhaps even more so, given that description.
Right.
He was actively looking for those bubbles to burst.
Precisely. He was a skeptic, by nature, always questioning those prevailing narratives.
Yeah.
Looking for cracks in the facade of prosperity.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to, put his money where his mouth was, even when it meant going up against these powerful syndicates, determined to maintain that status quo.
He sounds like he had nerves of steel.
He absolutely did. And his story, like Keene's, shows how someone who started with very little could climb to the top of Wall Street
Yeah.
through sheer skill and daring.
It's a testament to the power of independent thinking, of being able to, see through the hype and having the courage to act on your convictions, even when everyone else is telling you you're wrong.
Exactly. And that's one of the most valuable lessons we can take from Clews' book. It's a reminder that markets are driven by human psychology, and understanding those forces can be just as important as understanding, the fundamentals of finance.
I think we've given our listener a lot to digest already, just in this first part of our deep dive into, Henry Clews' world.
Yeah. I think we've introduced some of the key personalities.
Yeah.
Explored that concept of corners, touched on the central theme of speculation. But there's so much more to unpack here.
Let's take a moment to let all of this settle in, and then we'll come back for part 2, where we delve deeper into Clews' insights on panics, the role of government, and the lessons he draws from his, 50 years on Wall Street.
As we've been talking about these, larger-than-life figures and their moves, their audacious maneuvers, it's easy to get caught up in the excitement, the drama of it all.
It's like a financial thriller. Fortunes made and lost at like a dizzying pace.
Yeah.
But I'm also sensing this darker undercurrent here, like a sense of instability and the potential for disaster even.
You're picking up on something important.
Right.
Clews saw a lot of financial panics during his, 50 years on Wall Street.
Right.
And he spends a lot of time in the book analyzing those causes and consequences.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit then and delve into those panics. What were some of the key insights that he got from these tumultuous events?
Well, he argues that panics, while often triggered by specific events, they're ultimately the result of, deeper structural issues within the financial system.
Okay.
He points to things like excessive speculation, inadequate margins, and that inherent instability of fractional reserve banking as key contributors.
You mentioned fractional reserve banking. Can you explain to our listeners what that is and why Clews saw it as like a potential problem?
Fractional reserve banking. Well, it's a system where banks are allowed to lend out more money than they actually have on reserve.
Oh.
The idea is that, not everyone's going to demand all their money back at the same time.
Yeah.
So banks can keep a fraction in reserve, right? And lend out the rest, generate profits through interest.
Sounds a bit like juggling, keeping all those plates spinning.
Exactly. And as long as things are going well, it works. But Clews recognize that this system, it creates this inherent vulnerability.
Wow.
If depositors lose confidence, right, they might rush to withdraw their funds, leading to a bank run. And if enough banks experience this at the same time, it can trigger a wider panic and bring the whole financial system to a halt.
So Clews is basically saying that these panics aren't just like random accidents. They're almost built into the system itself, due to this practice of fractional reserve banking.
That's right. He compares a panic to like a storm at sea.
Okay.
The wind and the waves, they might be the immediate cause of a shipwreck, but the real culprit is a poorly built ship or a captain who ignores those warning signs.
I see. And he's also critical of the government's role in these crises, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he have some strong opinions on the sub-treasury system?
Oh, he did. The sub-treasury system, it was basically a way for the government to hold, its funds in its own vaults rather than depositing them in banks.
Okay.
And Clews argued that the system, while, it was meant to protect those government funds, it could actually worsen liquidity problems.
Okay.
During times of stress.
Oh.
Well, if the government's not, circulating its money through the banks, it reduces that overall amount of money available for lending and investment.
So when a panic hit, everyone needs cash,
Yeah.
and the government's money is just locked away, doing no good.
Exactly. Clews argued that, the system needed more flexibility to be able to, inject liquidity into the market when needed,
Yeah.
almost like a pressure valve, to release some of the stress during a crisis.
I see. This is where we see Clews, really deep understanding of the interconnectedness of the financial system. It's not just pointing fingers.
Right.
It's showing how seemingly small decisions, like where the government keeps its money, could have ripple effects throughout the entire economy.
Yeah, and he wasn't just, offering analysis. Clews, he describes how he actually worked
Yeah.
with Secretary Chase during the Civil War
Okay.
to develop new ways to finance the war,
Wow.
including issuing greenbacks, the first national paper currency.
So he was putting his money where his mouth was, so to speak, actively trying to find solutions to these these systemic problems.
Exactly. And he also championed, institutions like the Clearinghouse, which was formed by banks in New York to facilitate payments between the banks
Okay.
and provide liquidity during those times of crisis.
So the clearinghouse was kind of like a safety net, helping to prevent a total collapse of the banking system during panics.
That's right. It was a form of self-regulation, really,
Okay.
with banks pooling their resources and agreeing to support each other during those times of stress. And Clews believed this kind of cooperation was essential for, a healthy financial system.
Interesting. So he's balancing those critiques of the government and the banks with like a belief in the power of private institutions and self-regulation to kind of mitigate some of the risks.
Absolutely. He wasn't like, a dogmatic ideologue. He was a pragmatist, believed in finding practical solutions,
Yeah.
drawing on both public and private resources.
And that perspective feels very relevant to, our own time,
Oh, yeah.
right? I mean, we're still grappling with the same questions about the role of government, the stability of the financial system, how to prevent or at least soften the blow of those inevitable panics.
Absolutely. And Clews, he offers us this valuable historical lens
Yeah.
through which to view those very issues.
Right.
He shows us, how these problems have shown up in the past,
Yeah.
how people tried to address them, and the successes and failures of those efforts.
It's like he's saying, hey, look, we've been here before.
Right.
Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. Let's learn from those mistakes
Yeah.
and try to do better.
Exactly. He believed that a well-functioning financial system was essential
Yeah.
for, economic growth
Right.
and national prosperity. He understood that panics, they couldn't be totally eliminated,
Right.
but he believed they could be managed and their worst effects could be mitigated
Yeah.
through, prudent regulation, responsible banking practices, and a willingness to learn from those past mistakes.
It's a perspective that feels both like timeless and timely, given all the financial ups and downs we've seen in recent decades.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that history isn't just about, memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about understanding the patterns, the cycles, the forces that shape those events, especially when it comes to finance.
So we've got this framework now for understanding speculation, the dangers of corners, and that recurring threat of panics. But I think what really brings Clews' memoir to life are those stories he tells about the individuals who had to, navigate this complex and often treacherous world.
Oh, absolutely. He gives us those fascinating glimpses into, the lives and minds of the men who built Wall Street, their ambitions, their rivalries, their triumphs, their failures. It's like a who's who of Gilded Age titans, Vanderbilts, Drews, Goulds, Keens, and Wiershoffers, each one leaving their mark on the financial landscape, for better or worse.
And Clews knew them all personally.
He did.
It wasn't just an observer, he was a participant, a player in this high-stakes game.
Exactly. And that insider perspective gives his account a weight and authenticity that you just don't find in, those more detached historical accounts.
Yeah, it's like we're eavesdropping on history.
Yeah.
Getting that inside scoop on what was really happening
Oh, yeah.
behind closed doors. So where do we pick up with these fascinating characters? We've already talked about Vanderbilt, Drew, and Gould. Who's next?
Well, perhaps we should turn our attention to James Keene,
Okay.
the audacious short seller, who made a fortune betting against those, inflated bonanza stocks in San Francisco.
Okay, let's talk about Keene. He's a fascinating contrast to someone like Daniel Drew, who, seemed to chase the hype and get burned.
Yeah.
Keene saw through the hype, recognized that bubble,
Yeah.
and profited from it. That's amazing.
Exactly. Clews describes Keene as a man of exceptional courage and conviction.
Yeah.
He wasn't afraid to go against the crowd. Even when the stakes were high, he had this remarkable ability to read the market
Yeah.
and anticipate those shifts in sentiment. He understood crowd psychology, and he knew how to exploit the fear and greed that, that drives those speculative bubbles.
So he was a master of timing,
Yes.
knowing when to get in, when to get out, and not being afraid to go against the grain.
He absolutely was. And his story is a great reminder that sometimes those biggest opportunities are found by, going against that prevailing wisdom.
Clews tells us how Keene, after making his fortune in California, he came to New York to test his skills against the best Wall Street had to offer.
That's right. Yeah.
It's like he was stepping into the lion's den.
He was.
Going up against, Gould, Vanderbilt, on their own turf.
He was, and he more than held his own.
Wow.
Clews recounts how Keene, through a combination of, brilliant analysis and audacious risk-taking,
Right.
was able to outmaneuver some of the most seasoned operators on Wall Street.
It's amazing. It's a testament to the power of, independent thinking.
Absolutely.
Having the courage to bet against the crowd and trusting your own judgment, even when everyone else is saying you're wrong.
Precisely. Keene's story is this powerful reminder that success in the market, it often requires a contrarian mindset,
Right.
a willingness to see things differently from the herd.
It's a lesson that's as relevant today as it was back then.
Oh, yeah.
But we got one more fascinating figure to talk about.
Yeah.
Charles Weishaupt.
Ah, yes, Charles Weishaupt, the master of the short sale, and a true contrarian investor.
Clews describes him as a, quote, chronic and most destructive bear, which sounds kind of ominous.
Yeah.
Didn't he make his fortune by betting against the market?
He did. He was a master at spotting overvalued assets.
Okay.
And Clews tells us how Weishaupt, after initially making his fortune as a bull, transformed into this bear, believing that the excesses of the market, they would inevitably lead to a correction.
So he was like Keene in that he saw opportunity in those market downturns. But perhaps even more so given that description.
Right.
He was actively looking for bubbles to burst.
Exactly. He was a skeptic by nature, always questioning those prevailing narratives and looking for those cracks in the facade of prosperity. And he wasn't afraid to put his money where his mouth was, even when it meant, going up against those powerful syndicates who were determined to maintain that status quo.
Sounds like he had nerves of steel.
Oh, he absolutely did. And his story, like Keene's, it shows how someone who started with relatively little could climb to the top of Wall Street through sheer skill and daring.
It sounds like he was almost a lone wolf, fighting against the tide, but ultimately proving that it is possible to succeed by going against the grain.
That's a great way to put it. Weishaupt's story, like Keene's, is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest opportunities, they're found in, challenging conventional wisdom and having the courage to bet against the crowd.
It's a theme that runs throughout Clews' memoir.
It is.
Isn't it? It's like he's showing us that there is no one path to success on Wall Street.
Right.
But certain qualities like, independence, courage, and a contrarian mindset can be incredibly valuable when you're navigating this complex and often volatile world.
Absolutely. And that's one of the key takeaways. I hope our listeners glean from, this deep dive into 50 years in Wall Street. It's not just about understanding, the mechanics of finance.
Right.
It's about understanding the human element,
Right.
the psychology, and the importance of, developing those qualities that allow you to thrive in a world of uncertainty and risk.
Clews has given us a glimpse into the lives of these extraordinary individuals, their successes, their failures, the lessons we can learn from their experiences. But before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's just take a moment here to let all this information sink in and prepare ourselves for even more insights and revelations from this fascinating memoir. Okay, so we've met these titans of the Gilded Age, right? We've seen those wild corners, felt the tremors of those financial panics. But, stepping back a bit, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting impression Clews leaves us with?
I think it's that feeling of, audacity mixed with caution, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so.
Clews himself was right there in the thick of it, financing wars, building his firm, yet he never loses sight of, how fragile it all is.
Right. And that makes his memoir so much more than just, here's how I got rich story.
Oh, absolutely.
There's real wisdom there, almost a philosophical side to how he views the market and the men who shaped it.
Right. He admires their ambition, their ingenuity, but he never shies away from their ruthlessness or, those ethical gray areas they were operating in.
Yeah.
And it's that balanced view that makes his writing so compelling.
Clews doesn't, try to hide the fact that a lot of these guys were playing hardball.
Yeah.
Bending rules, breaking them even
Yeah.
to get ahead. But he also recognizes their role in building, well, a modern American economy,
Yeah.
risky as their methods were.
Yeah, and that's the complexity that I find most intriguing.
Yeah.
He's not trying to paint them as heroes or villains. He's showing us these men as they were. Brilliant, flawed, driven by a mix of, noble and self-serving motives, like all of us, really.
It's a reminder that history is, well, it's rarely black and white.
It's not.
These weren't just robber barons. They were visionaries, risk takers, and yeah, sometimes manipulators. But beyond the personalities, what are some of the broader lessons that Clews wants us to take away from his, 50 years on Wall Street?
One that really sticks out is his emphasis on the cyclical nature of markets.
Yeah.
He saw firsthand how booms and busts were just, well, inevitable part of the process, and ignoring that pattern could be disastrous.
It's like he's saying, don't get caught up in the euphoria of a bull market.
Right.
Always remember that what goes up must come down.
Yeah.
And it feels, almost prophetic, given all the bubbles and crashes we've seen more recently.
Exactly. And he ties this directly to human psychology. Fear, greed, the herd mentality. Those are driving forces back then, and they're still driving forces in the markets today.
Clews was writing way before, behavioral economics became a thing.
Right.
But he clearly understood how those psychological biases could really warp judgment, especially when it comes to money.
Absolutely. And another point he stresses is the importance of information, or rather the dangers of misinformation.
No.
He saw how rumors, speculation, hype, they could distort markets and lead to bad decisions.
And I mean, we're living this age of information overload.
Right.
Social media, 24/7 news. It's harder than ever to filter out the noise and make good decisions based on facts, not hype.
Yeah, and that's why Clews' warning about relying on, points, those insider tips, it feels so relevant. He argues that true success in the market, it comes from, careful analysis, sound judgment, and a willingness to think for yourself.
It's about doing your own homework.
Right.
Not just chasing that latest hot stock tip or falling for those get-rich-quick schemes.
Exactly. Clews was a big believer in developing your own, independent understanding of the market rather than blindly following the crowd.
He also leaves us with some interesting things to think about.
Yeah.
About the role of government in the economy.
He does.
Right. He criticizes that sub-treasury system for making panics worse. But he also expresses concern about excessive regulation, stifling innovation.
It's a tough balance, isn't it?
It is.
How do you create stability without hindering, well, the dynamism of free markets?
It's a debate that's still going strong today. And Clews doesn't give us easy answers, but he provides, that historical context for understanding how complex this issue really is. He shows us how government intervention can backfire, but also how lack of regulation can lead to, rampant speculation and instability.
He seems to be arguing for a middle ground, a system that promotes responsibility, but doesn't stifle creativity and risk-taking.
So what does all this mean for our listener? The one who's thinking, okay, this Gilded Age stuff is fascinating, but how does it apply to me?
I think Henry Clews would say, don't underestimate the power of history to illuminate the present.
Yeah, I like that.
His memoir offers these timeless insights into market psychology, the dangers of speculation, and the importance of thinking for yourself. Those are lessons that are just as relevant today as they were a century ago.
We've seen how those booms and busts, they're just part of the cycle. Now, even the most brilliant minds can make disastrous decisions. And how understanding, the psychology behind markets can be just as important as crunching the numbers.
Absolutely. And Clews' story, it reminds us that success, it's not just about luck or following the latest trends.
Right.
It's about developing that sound understanding of how things work, having the courage to go against the grain when necessary, and always remembering that, history often repeats itself.
It's almost like he's saying, study the past if you want to profit from the future.
Exactly. And he gives us this incredible case study filled with real-world examples of how those principles played out during one of the most dynamic periods in American financial history.
So a final thought here for our listener to ponder.
Okay.
Clews focuses mainly on the world of high finance, right? Those big players on Wall Street.
Yeah.
But what about the ripple effects of their actions?
Yeah.
How did those booms and busts impact, everyday Americans? outside of Wall Street.
That's a question worth exploring, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did those decisions made in those smoky back rooms affect, the farmers, the factory workers, the shopkeepers, the families across the country?
Right.
It's a reminder that financial markets, they're not just these abstract systems.
Right.
They have a real impact on people's lives, for better or worse.
It's a powerful reminder that history is made up of those individual stories. And those stories often have, far-reaching consequences.
And that's what makes, 50 Years in Wall Street such a valuable read.
Yeah.
It's a story of ambition, risk, and the power of human nature to shape the course of events.
It's a story that really resonates, across the decades, offering us these valuable lessons about the market, about ourselves, and about, how interconnected our world really is. So until next time, happy investing.
And may your decisions be guided by wisdom, not just by hype.